Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown, and he knelt, then disappeared forever. A fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. He knelt before vanishing forever. He knelt in front of the altar, whispered a name no one else could hear, then was gone before the echo reached the stone walls. The morning it happened, St. Sebastian's was bathed in the kind of pale, silver fog that made everything look like a memory. Mrs. Caulfield was the first to notice the empty pew. She always sat third from the front, left side, across from Mr. Alderton. She claimed she'd seen the kneeling man, head bowed, fingers trembling. But when she turned back from lighting her candle, the space was empty. No door creaked, no breeze shifted. The church was silent as a tomb. That man's name was Jonathan Greaves, an accountant, a widower, a man of no particular interest, except, of course, for the fact that he'd recently told his neighbor that he knew something so holy it could destroy a soul. Father Brown was called only after the police had finished dusting for fingerprints that weren't there. No security camera footage, no footprints, not even a smudge on the kneeler's velvet. It was as if Jonathan had ceased to exist. At the exact moment, he'd surrendered himself to something unseen. And yet, the kneeling was deliberate, as if he meant to disappear, as if the act itself was part of a ritual. Father Brown stood by the altar that afternoon, eyes soft but searching. He was not looking for blood or a body. He was listening for what had been said or left unsaid. That church had heard everything, and he believed stone never forgets. He asked the verger one question. "Has anything been moved?" "Only the candelabrum," she said. "We polished it. It had fingerprints, unusual ones, long, thin, smudged like they were burnt." Father Brown didn't flinch. He only nodded once, as if a distant bell had been struck in his mind. The fog thickened that evening, draping over the village like a judgment. Rumors ran through it like rats. Was it suicide? A kidnapping? A miracle? Jonathan had no enemies, no debt, no reason to vanish. But something about the way he knelt haunted people. He wasn't praying. He wasn't crying. He was waiting. That night, Father Brown found something the police had missed. A single communion wafer, unblessed, tucked beneath the altar cloth. "Why hide something sacred," he murmured, "unless it was never meant to be found?" The next day, the police received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo. It showed Jonathan Greaves kneeling. Yes, the exact moment, but the photo was wrong. There were hands on his shoulders, pale hands, translucent, reaching from behind. But there had been no one else in the church. The camera had been hidden, its source unknown. The timestamp was 3 minutes after he vanished. Father Brown looked at the image for a long time. Then he turned it upside down. The hands looked like wings. "This," he whispered, "is not what it claims to be." From that moment, the case unraveled backward. Jonathan had received a package the week before his disappearance, a relic, said to belong to a long-dead saint, whose final sermon was said to drive men mad. The relic had vanished too. But something else was found in his house, hidden in the fireplace, a torn page from his journal, half burnt, but legible. If I kneel, they say it must be of my own will, but I do not know whose voice I heard, only that it was beautiful and wrong. What kind of voice could be both? Father Brown visited the chapel again, this time alone. He stared at the kneeler, then slowly went down on one knee himself. He closed his eyes. A minute passed, then two. Then the bell outside rang, though no one had pulled the rope. He stood abruptly. There was a presence here, he said aloud, but not of heaven. The next twist came from the morgue. Yes, the morgue. A body was found in the river, burned, but still bearing the ID of Jonathan Greaves. Except the teeth didn't match, and someone had carved a cross onto the body's chest. A false corpse, a message. But from who? Father Brown met with the bishop, asked for records of any exorcisms or secret rites involving kneeling. One stood out. A man who had once claimed he could kneel into heaven if he shed every earthly lie. That man had also vanished, decades ago. Father Brown visited the man's last known address, an abandoned rectory at the edge of the moor. There, hidden behind a brick wall, was a journal, identical handwriting to Jonathan's, dated 25 years earlier. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a ritual, passed down, repeated, and always ending in disappearance. But why? Back in the village, someone began leaving candles lit in the church, 3 at a time, always unlit by morning, a pattern, a sign. Then Mrs. Caulfield went missing. Same church, same pew. The only thing left behind was her shawl, neatly folded, and a smear of ash on the kneeler. Father Brown's voice, calm as ever, grew colder. "This is no longer a case of missing persons," he said. "This is worship, of something that was never meant to be adored." He returned to the church one last time, this time during a storm. The rain hammered the stained glass. The pews groaned. And there, in the center aisle, he saw it. A man, kneeling. But when he approached, there was no man, only a mirror, placed deliberately, facing the altar. Father Brown picked it up and saw the inscription on the back. "Those who kneel, vanish. Those who see, must choose." He turned toward the altar and whispered, "Then I choose to remember." But the mirror cracked, on its own, from within. The camera feed inside the church, one hastily installed after Jonathan vanished, caught static, then silence, then a voice, distorted, barely human. He knelt. He saw. He knew. And then the screen went black. No one saw Father Brown leave the church that night, but in the morning, the mirror was gone, and in its place, a single candle, still burning, no wax, no heat, just light, and the faint scent of ash. "I know who did it," Father Brown's voice was heard saying in a recording days later, "but the truth will never be told, because to tell it would be to kneel, and I will never kneel again." Chapter 2. The Confession That Killed Him. He had barely finished whispering, "Forgive me, Father," when blood trickled from his ear, and he collapsed dead in the confessional. It was a Thursday, early evening. The chapel bathed in a dying light that filtered through red-stained glass like dripping wine. The confession booth was old, creaking, built when secrets were heavier and the dead were buried without questions. Father Brown was sitting inside, patient, hands folded, when the man entered. A stranger, mid-40s, wearing a grey overcoat far too warm for the season. He had eyes that refused to blink and a voice that cracked as if it had never spoken the truth before. "I have sinned," he said, "but I don't think God was watching when I did it." Father Brown listened. That was his gift. Silence. A silence that made people talk far more than they meant to. But the words that came next changed everything. I was there when it happened, but I didn't stop it. I wanted it to happen. I wanted the scream. Then a pause. I took the photo after. Father Brown asked gently, "What photo, my son?" The man leaned closer and whispered something only Father Brown heard. A name, a place, a time. Then his whole body shuddered, like something had reached inside and pulled. A single gasp, then nothing. By the time Father Brown stepped out, the man was slumped, lifeless, eyes wide open, staring into the wooden lattice as if trying to burn the last secret into it. There was no wound, no weapon, no sign of trauma, except for the blood from the ear. The doctor later called it aneurysmal rupture from extreme psychological trauma. But Father Brown knew better. Words can kill. Truths can be poison. And this man had confessed something too dangerous to be heard. When the constable arrived, they found no identification, no wallet, no phone, no keys, just a single folded newspaper clipping in his coat pocket, dated exactly 1 year ago. It read, "Girl disappears after leaving church choir. Practice, foul play suspected." The photo showed a 17-year-old named Lillian Shaw. She had vanished from this very parish. Her case had gone cold. Father Brown stared at the clipping. Something in the photo, no, behind her, caught his eye. A blurred figure in the shadows of the choir loft. A man in a grey overcoat. It wasn't just a confession. It was a confession made too late, and someone or something had made sure it would never be repeated. He reviewed the booth. No traps, no poisons, but a faint smell remained, like burnt ozone and old stone. Father Brown had smelled it once before, in a monastery where monks went mad after hearing the same whisper in their dreams. He requested the booth be sealed off. "This is not ordinary wood," he said quietly. "It remembers." The next day, the church organist came forward, shaking. She said she'd heard something strange while practicing a hymn the night before. It was like a second voice, she whispered, but it was in reverse, the Lord's Prayer, backwards. That same night, the lights flickered in the chapel, and in the flicker, several parishioners claimed to see a shadow kneeling at the altar. Just kneeling, never moving, staring toward the confession box. Then, a second death. The newspaper archivist who had first reported Lillian Shaw's disappearance was found in his study, pen in hand, dead. A single word scribbled over and over. "I listened. I listened. I listened." Father Brown visited the man's home. There, beneath the desk, was a cassette recorder, still running. He played it back. Nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice. "Do you want to hear what he told me?" Click. Static again, and then a breath that didn't belong to anyone alive. Father Brown closed the recorder. His hands were steady, but inside his chest, a familiar chill coiled like a serpent. "This isn't about one man's guilt," he said to himself. "This is about something that uses guilt as bait." He returned to the confessional, sat where the man had died, closed his eyes, waited. 10 minutes passed. Then a voice, soft as dust, from the other side of the screen. "You know who I am." Father Brown didn't respond. You heard what he said. Still, silence. Then a laugh. But not like laughter, like a memory of someone laughing, stretched too thin. "I told him the truth, and it broke him." The voice faded. Father Brown opened the curtain and found the other side empty. But the candle by the altar had blown out. The bishop warned him to stop. "This is not your burden," he said. "Let the police investigate." But the police didn't believe in ghosts. And ghosts, Father Brown had learned, don't care about jurisdiction. He followed the name the man had whispered. It led him to a long, abandoned orphanage outside the village. Burned in 1982, closed after 3 disappearances, but its files, sealed in diocesan archives, revealed one pattern. Every 10 years, someone who had lived there died after making a confession in that same booth. Not just guilt, not just sin, but the same booth, the same words. Father Brown tracked down a survivor, a woman named Clara, now in her 60s, living in a care home. She hadn't spoken in years, but when shown the picture of the dead man, she wept. Then took a pencil and shakily wrote one phrase on the back of the photo. We all made the same mistake. We all listened. Father Brown returned once more to the church. The confessional had been closed off. Police tape stretched over it like a bandage over something still bleeding. But someone had torn the tape. Inside, he found another body. A young man, same posture, same blood from the ear. No ID, only a Bible. Open to a single verse, underlined in red, "And the truth shall make you free." But scrawled beneath it, in a shaky, terrified hand, it lied. Father Brown sat down on the front pew, hands trembling now, for the first time. "I know what this is," he said softly. "It is not the voice of God that answers in that booth." He left the church that night and walked into the fog. Didn't return for 3 days. When he did, he had a key. A very old key. He opened a compartment beneath the confessional floor. There, buried deep, was a small black book. Inside, names, dates, locations, and confessions. Thousands, all written by the same hand, the same pen. Some of the confessions described murders that had never been solved. Others, things that hadn't yet happened. And still others, words in languages no human should know. The final page was blank, except for one sentence. The next one to kneel, must be willing to die, knowing nothing. Father Brown closed the book, locked it, burned it in the sacristy furnace. But as it burned, the confessional creaked. Once, like something shifting inside. He never reopened the booth. But sometimes, when the church is empty and the wind presses against the glass, a voice still echoes faintly. "Forgive me, Father. I lied." Father Brown no longer walks past the booth. He walks around it. And every night before locking the church, he lights a candle. Not in prayer, but as a warning. Because the confession didn't kill that man. It was what answered him back. And though Father Brown knows who or what it is, he will never say, because the truth is the most dangerous thing of all. And not every voice inside a church wants to be forgiven. Chapter 3. She lied before she died. She swore with her dying breath that she had never seen the man before, while clutching the locket that held his photograph. The storm had just begun when the call came. A woman had collapsed in the nave of St. Oswald's, her body curled like a question at the foot of the baptismal font. Her name was Miss Eliza Tremaine, the retired headmistress of the girls' school on the hill, respected, controlled, feared. She was known for her perfectly ironed collars, her silence during sermons, and her habit of locking her classroom door from the inside even when no one was watching. She hadn't set foot in the church in over 10 years, until that night. And when she did, she was dying. The verger said she had staggered in through the side entrance, soaked to the skin, eyes wide and unblinking, as if she had seen something unspeakable. She collapsed without a word, but as Father Brown leaned in, she gasped once, like her throat had forgotten how to speak, and then said, "I never knew him. I never," before the final breath escaped and left her mouth forever open. But it was the locket that changed everything. Father Brown found it clutched in her hand, fingers stiff as iron, refusing to let go, even in death. When they pried it open, the photograph inside was not of a family member or some long-lost lover. It was a man, late 20s, dark eyes, clean-shaven, wearing a clerical collar. The face, Father Brown realized, belonged to someone who had been dead for 13 years. Father Marcus Fielding, a young priest, murdered. His body had been found behind the very church where Eliza now died, and his case had never been solved. Worse, at the time, Eliza Tremaine had given a statement. "I never knew him." Father Brown remembered the trial, the rumors, the silence. Father Marcus had arrived in Kemble Cross from a parish in Leeds and barely lasted 6 weeks. He had died with no sign of struggle, no known enemies, no visible wounds. Just vanished from his room and reappeared in the churchyard, lying under the statue of St. Michael, eyes wide open, mouth filled with communion wafers. And now Eliza had returned, to die, holding his picture, claiming the same lie she told 13 years ago. The question wasn't why she lied, it was who made her lie again before she died. Father Brown examined the locket. There was no inscription, but the photograph was unusually sharp for its time. It looked new, too new. When the local chemist examined it, he confirmed something deeply unsettling. It had been printed within the last month, using paper and ink that didn't exist in 2012, let alone the 90s. Someone had given her this photo recently. But why? Why reopen a wound so old? And why force her into the church, to collapse beneath the very font where she once baptized hundreds of young girls? Father Brown visited her cottage. The house was silent, frozen in a kind of mourning. Long before she passed, dishes untouched, a cup of tea gone cold, but on the table, a letter, unopened, no return address. Inside, a single sentence, typed in crimson ink. "Tell the truth before Sunday, or we open the crypt." There was no signature, but the envelope carried a faint scent. Lilies, the same scent that had filled the chapel the morning Father Marcus was buried. It had rained then, too. No thunder, just that steady, falling curtain of grey. Father Brown knew the crypt beneath the church, locked since 1937, used only twice since. One of those was for Father Marcus. He descended the steps that evening, key in hand. The crypt door creaked open after years of protest. Inside, the air was stale, but disturbed. A breeze, an unnatural cold. And there, scrawled on the inside of the crypt wall in chalk, fresh, recent, childlike letters. "She lied. We watched her lie." The handwriting matched none of the known villagers, but it mirrored the writing in an old-school ledger Father Brown had seen in the archive, a ledger from 1997. The year Eliza expelled a girl named Anna Cartwright for blasphemy, except Anna had never returned home. Her parents received a note claiming she had joined a convent abroad, but there were no records, no passport, no correspondence, and Anna had vanished. 3 weeks after Eliza's expulsion letter, Father Marcus was dead. Father Brown sought out the Cartwright family, now moved to Dorset. The mother had passed. The father, old and trembling, simply said, "She cried the day she left, said something evil lived in the school's chapel, said the prayers came from somewhere wrong." Then he added, "Anna never lied, except once. She said she forgave Miss Tremaine, but I don't think she ever did." The next morning, the church cleaner found something that made her scream. The baptismal font, where Eliza died, was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, all of Eliza, some teaching, some smiling, some sleeping. But in each photo, there was a shape behind her, a shadow, always the same, a figure in clerical black, but never fully visible, always standing behind her, watching, and in one photo, the face was visible. It was Father Marcus. Father Brown's hands went cold. It was not just memory, it was surveillance. But by whom? And how? The church had no cameras. No photographs were ever taken during services, and yet these images were detailed, perfectly timed, intimate in a way that felt impossible. The final photo, taken the night of her death, showed Eliza stepping into the church, and the figure behind her now had a face. It wasn't Father Marcus, it was Anna, aged, ghostly, unmistakably her, except Anna had never grown up, because she was never seen again after that expulsion. Father Brown stood at the altar that evening and whispered, "This is not about guilt. It's about what guilt refuses to forget." Then he turned and saw the pew where Eliza always sat, empty but wet, as if someone had been crying there. Father Brown returned to Eliza's cottage one final time. In the fireplace, he found a hidden drawer. Inside, a diary, Eliza's. Its final entry read, "She came to me, eyes full of fire. She asked why I lied. I told her the truth would destroy everything. She smiled, said, 'It already did.'" The next page had been ripped out and burned, but one fragment remained, curling at the edge of the hearth. "I saw her fall. I told Marcus she was possessed. He believed me. He said we had to protect the others. But she wasn't possessed. She was—" It ended there. But that was enough. Enough to know that Father Marcus had acted on Eliza's lie. And that lie cost him his soul, and Anna her life, and Eliza her peace. But that didn't explain the photographs, or the shadow, or the fact that the locket had been placed in Eliza's hand after her death, because her fingers showed no bruising, no grip. It had been posed by someone else, someone who wanted the lie to be remembered and punished. At the next Mass, Father Brown noticed something strange. A new girl in the front pew, silent, pale, eyes never blinking. She never took communion, never bowed her head. And after the service, when he looked for her, she was gone. But in the pew where she sat, another photo of Eliza, standing at the church steps, with Anna beside her, smiling, holding hands. But it was dated 3 days before Eliza died. Father Brown said nothing. He took the photo, placed it beneath the altar, and lit a candle. Then he whispered, "I know who did it. But the truth, the real truth, it doesn't care about forgiveness, only that someone remembers." And when he left the church that night, the rain had stopped, but the pew where the girl sat remained wet. Chapter 4. Father Brown's most chilling silence. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that escaped wasn't his voice, and what followed was the longest silence the village has ever known. They say silence can be peaceful, even holy. But on that evening in Kemble Cross, the silence that fell after Father Brown stepped away from the altar was not peace. It was punishment. It was a silence so complete, it erased the sound of wind, the ticking of clocks, even the echo of memory, and no one who witnessed it has ever truly spoken of it since, not because they were told not to, but because something inside them still trembles at the thought of trying. The service had begun like any other, a midweek vigil for All Souls' Day, sparsely attended. A few elderly women in black shawls, a widower who never missed a mass, 2 altar boys more interested in fidgeting than faith, and Father Brown, gentle, familiar, precise. But when he began the homily, his voice faltered, his hands gripped the lectern, his eyes shifted, not toward the congregation, but toward the old choir loft above. empty, supposedly. And then he stopped speaking altogether. One word into his sermon. Mercy, and nothing more. He froze, his eyes fixed, his mouth still open, but no words came. At first, the congregation waited. They thought perhaps he'd forgotten his place or had a moment of dizziness, but the seconds stretched into a minute, then 2, then 5, and still no movement, no breath, no blink, just silence. Then the lights flickered. Then came the smell. It wasn't incense. It was something older, fouler, like wet stone and burnt cloth. One of the altar boys dropped the censer and ran. Another began to cry. And yet Father Brown remained at the pulpit, unmoving, eyes locked upward, until, at last, he collapsed. But the silence didn't end. Even as the congregation gathered, whispering, trying to call his name, no sound came from their mouths. Their lips moved, but the air remained still. No voices, no breathing. Even the church bell, struck manually in panic, made no noise. Then, as abruptly as it began, the silence lifted, and Father Brown gasped. But he did not speak. Not that day, not the day after, not for 7 full days. They brought in doctors, specialists, a psychologist from London. None could explain what had happened. His vocal cords were fine, his mind alert. He simply would not speak. And worst of all, he refused to write. Not a word, not a single explanation. But at night, the nurses heard him. He would rise from bed, walk to the window, and whisper something, not loud enough to understand, but soft enough to chill the blood. Because they were sure he wasn't whispering to himself. On the 6th night, they caught him in the chapel. He'd taken a candle and drawn a symbol on the pulpit floor in melted wax. A circle, a cross, and something else. Something not of the church. Something ancient. When asked what it meant, he only stared at the candle, now extinguished. Then finally, on the 7th day, he spoke. Just one sentence. The sermon wasn't mine. And then silence again. What sermon? What voice? The church warden confessed something strange. He had found a page in the pulpit before the Mass. Not Father Brown's handwriting. Older. Rough. The page contained a sermon, dated 1901. But it wasn't from the Bible. It was titled, "To the Ones Who Wait Above the Choir," and it spoke of things beneath the church, things older than saints, things that once sang but were silenced. The handwriting matched a journal found years earlier, buried in the rectory cellar. The journal of Father Thomas Reddick, the first priest to vanish from the village. Vanished, not transferred, not dead, just gone. One entry in the journal had always been dismissed as the ramblings of a madman. It read, "The 4th sermon will never be spoken. If it is, the bell will not ring again." That week, the bell rope frayed and snapped on its own. Father Brown, now silent once more, returned to the church that Sunday, against protest, against advice. He climbed the pulpit again, and everyone held their breath. He opened the Bible, read the passage, then closed it. And instead of speaking, he held up a single page, blank, and pointed upward, toward the choir loft. That night, the verger found a child's shoe, up there, covered in dust, but it hadn't been there before. The shoe was dated 1922, and inside it, a folded paper, a drawing of a priest, mouth open, surrounded by eyes. No face, just eyes. The drawing was signed. I saw him too. That week, a visitor arrived in the village. A man with no name, no luggage. He asked to see Father Brown. Said he'd heard the silence had returned. When he was denied entry, he left a gift, a stone, carved with a single word, "Remember." Father Brown held the stone that night, and for the first time since the collapse, He wept. Then, for 3 days straight, he did not leave the pulpit. He ate nothing, drank nothing, slept sitting up, watching the choir loft. And on the third night, the villagers heard it. Music, a single note, low, drawn out, as if from a voice that had no body, just breath. And it came from the choir. They rushed to the church. Father Brown was gone, but on the pulpit, burned into the wood. I did not break the silence, it broke me. He was found the next morning, in his room, sitting by the window, eyes open, mouth closed, a single note left behind. The fourth sermon will not be given, but someone else has started to write the fifth. The bishop sealed the church, but that didn't stop the sound. It still comes, once a week, low, faint, and always from above. No one knows what Father Brown saw. No one knows what tried to speak through him. But when asked, years later, what he remembers most about that week, he simply whispered, "I was never alone in that pulpit." And then he smiled, but not in peace, in warning. Chapter 5. One clue he couldn't forget. The murdered man's watch stopped at 9:13 p.m., but the photograph taken moments before his death clearly showed it's still ticking. It was the kind of detail no one noticed at first. A cracked watch face, blood-streaked glass, a silver band clinging to a cold, lifeless wrist. The death of Harold Whitlow had already baffled the village. A man known for solitude, sharp opinions, and his obsessive punctuality. He died sitting upright in his study, the fire still burning, a book in his lap, and a faint smile on his face. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no poison, no struggle. But when Father Brown was asked to perform the blessing over the body, he spotted the detail that would haunt him for weeks. The watch, frozen at 9:13 p.m., even though Harold had been seen alive at 9:18 by his neighbor, captured in a flashlit photo standing by his own front window, waving. The camera didn't lie, but something else did. At first, it seemed trivial. Watches fail, batteries die. But this was Harold, a man who wound that watch every morning at 6 EOE sharp, who called the police once when the church bell rang 30 seconds late, who refused to own a digital clock because he said, time must be heard, not just seen. And yet, 5 minutes had gone missing, or something had forced them to. The coroner's report showed no anomalies. Heart failure, they said, natural causes. But Father Brown couldn't shake it. That watch, that single clue, pressed against his thoughts like a cold thumb. And he remembered something else. The hands of the watch weren't just stuck at 9:13. They were pointing directly at the spine of the book Harold had been reading, a book of poetry, open to a page titled, "The Hour You'll Regret." He turned the page. The next poem was gone, ripped out, the torn edge jagged, recent. And suddenly, the death was not so natural. The house itself gave nothing more. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, but Harold's. But the camera, the neighbor's photo, held a secret. In the reflection of the window, behind Harold's waving figure, something unnatural loomed. A blur. Not a person, not quite. It was like a figure made of absence. Where light should be, there was nothing. A shape only the eye could doubt. Father Brown asked for the original photograph. Under magnification, he saw the impossible. The shape in the background was wearing a long coat, and its left hand was reaching out toward Harold's watch. That's when Father Brown began to dream. In his dreams, the church bell rang 13 times every night, exactly at 9:13 p.m., no matter when he fell asleep, always that hour, always that sound, but no one else heard it, until the night it rang for real. The bell tower had been rusted shut for decades, yet at 9:13 p.m. precisely, the church bell sounded once, loud, deep, echoing through the village like a morning cry. And in the morning, the bell rope was wet, not with rain, but with blood, not fresh, old, blackened, as if someone or something had been waiting to ring it for years. Then the letters started arriving. No return address, no writing on the envelope, just a single slip of paper inside. The first letter said, "The hour is a door." The second, "Harold opened it." The third, "Now it must close." And then the police received an anonymous tip. A second body, unmarked grave, edge of the moor. They dug, and found nothing at first, just a coffin, empty, except for a photograph. Harold, younger, standing beside a man no one recognized, both smiling, both wearing the same watch. But the stranger's watch stopped at 9:13. Father Brown traced the photo. It had been altered. The background was wrong. The shadows impossible. Sunlight shining from both sides. He brought the photo to a light table. There, beneath the layers, faintly, barely visible, was another figure. A woman, eyes blacked out, mouth covered. The original image had been overwritten. Someone had tried to erase her, and yet she remained, silent, watching. The library archives confirmed it. Harold had been engaged once to a woman named Eveline Carr, a schoolteacher. She vanished the week before their wedding. No body, no explanation, just a letter found in Harold's coat pocket. "I cannot marry you, I cannot return. You will understand one day, when the hour comes." Dated June 6, 1952. 9:13 p.m. The same hour, the same clue. Father Brown went to the oldest church records, flipping through yellowing pages until he found it. An exorcism report from 1953. Performed not on a person, but a house. Harold's house. It had once belonged to a priest who claimed he could trap time. Said the devil lived in seconds, not souls. That house had stood silent for decades after he died, until Harold bought it and rebuilt the clock embedded in its fireplace. The fireplace no one ever used, because the fire always burned cold. Father Brown returned there, alone. At 9 p.m., he entered the house. By 9:11, the air had gone still, and by 9:13, the second hand on Harold's repaired grandfather clock began to tick backward. One click, then another. The fireplace flared blue, and Father Brown felt the hair on his arms rise. He looked to the mantel, and there, someone had placed a note. It hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. It read, "You asked why the watch stopped. It didn't. It waited." And beneath the note, something he hadn't seen in years. A torn page, from the poetry book, the missing one. But the title, it wasn't a poem. It was a warning. "If you read this, look away." He didn't. He read every word. And what he saw, what he read, what filled his mind in those next seconds, he never told anyone. But after that night, Father Brown's hair turned white at the temples, and he never wore a watch again. He simply said, "I know who did it, but that clue wasn't for me, it was for whoever comes next." And now, the church clock refuses to strike 9:13. It jumps from 9:12 to 9:14 every single night, as if time itself won't acknowledge what happened, or perhaps what was let in. Because there are clues that solve cases, and there are clues that open doors. Father Brown found one, and he never forgot it, because it never let him. Chapter 6. The alibi that wasn't real. The man accused of murder proved he was at a wedding the entire night, but the bride and groom died in a fire 3 years before. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it made people question their own memories. Everyone had just heard Thomas Elbridge's defense, and on paper, it was airtight. Dozens of photographs, a guestbook entry, a video clip of him clapping as the couple danced, all of it placing him at the Whitcomb wedding on the night of January 13th. The same night, Lucille Granger was found strangled in her cottage on the edge of the village. A brutal killing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind, except for a single strand of wool from Thomas's signature green scarf. And yet here he stood, arms folded, smiling faintly, absolutely confident, because he had an alibi, one so clean, so perfectly timed, that even the lead investigator had begun to doubt their case, until Father Brown requested a copy of the wedding program. It had been printed on linen cardstock, crisp and elegant, with the names Marina and Daniel Whitcomb embossed in silver at the top. The date clearly read January 13th. Everything seemed ordinary, until Father Brown turned to the back and saw a prayer he himself had written, one that was first published in a diocesan newsletter 2 years after the Whitcombs were already dead. The contradiction struck him like thunder. He stared at the paper again. The prayer was there, in full. But how could it be if the wedding supposedly took place years earlier? The Whitcombs were buried in the village cemetery. Their death had made national news. A fire caused by faulty wiring at their reception hall, killing not only the couple, but 15 guests. There had been no survivors. And yet Thomas claimed he'd attended that very wedding 3 years after the fire. The evidence he'd submitted, photos, guestbook entries, a video, suddenly became more terrifying than comforting. Not because they were faked, but because they seemed too real. The footage was clean, the lighting consistent. The guestbook was full of names belonging to real people in the village. People who now claimed to remember attending. People who were alive, or at least used to be, because one by one, those people started to disappear. First was Mr. Hulworth, the florist, then Jane Deering, the cellist, then Oliver Finch, the bartender who remembered serving champagne that night. All gone. No sign of struggle, no goodbye, just missing. And each of their homes contained the same chilling item, a wedding favor from the Whitcomb ceremony, a tiny silver bell. But when Father Brown examined the bells, he found something wrong. They didn't ring. They weren't hollow. Inside each one was a fragment of scorched paper. The first read, "We danced too long." The second, "Time forgets what fire remembers." The third had no words, only a number, 13. 13 guests, 13 missing, 13 years since the fire. Father Brown returned to the cemetery, to the Whitcomb's grave. The soil was disturbed, fresh, as if someone had tried to dig, but not from above, from beneath. He stood in the cold wind and whispered, "This is not about murder. This is about memory." And that was when he received the invitation. Delivered by hand. No postmark, no fingerprints. A pure, white envelope. "You are cordially invited to the second wedding of Marina and Daniel Whitcomb. January 13th, midnight, St. Jude's Chapel." But St. Jude's had burned down with the Whitcombs. There was no building left, only the charred stone arch of what had once been the entrance. And yet, when Father Brown arrived that night, dressed in black and trembling beneath his cassock, the bells were ringing. Faintly, slowly, he walked through the archway and saw pews, guests, candles, all flickering in a church that should not exist. At the front stood Marina, in her dress, perfect, unaged, smiling. Beside her, Daniel, equally pristine, both staring at Father Brown, waiting. A voice whispered in his ear, Everyone must attend, even the priest. He stepped back, refusing to cross the threshold. But behind him, someone else arrived. Thomas Elbridge, his face pale, eyes wide. "I told them I was there," he whispered. "I had to be. I was invited." Father Brown reached into his coat, pulled out a rosary, and held it toward the couple. The church began to flicker. The pews cracked. The guests, once still, turned their heads all at once, all with burnt, featureless faces, all ringing bells that made no sound. Thomas screamed, ran forward, and disappeared. No footsteps, no echo, only silence. Father Brown turned back toward the arch, and the chapel was gone. Only ruin remained. But at his feet, a wedding photograph, undamaged. In it stood Thomas, smiling, arm around Marina, bride and guest. Underneath the photo, a handwritten message. The alibi wasn't real, but now it is. Father Brown never saw Thomas again. The trial was closed. No body, no crime. The case, unsolved. But the bells, they still ring. Only once a year. At midnight, on January 13th, and no one in the village dares to walk past the ruins of St. Jude's because they say the guest book is still there, still open, waiting for one more name. And when asked if he knows who killed Lucille Granger, Father Brown only replies, he didn't kill her. He never left the wedding. Chapter 7. He spoke, then was gone. The man walked into the chapel, whispered 5 words into Father Brown's ear, and vanished before anyone else could hear them. It happened at dusk, just as the shadows outside began to lengthen into strange shapes along the stone walls. The evening service had concluded, and only 3 people remained behind. Father Brown, sweeping near the altar, the verger locking the main doors, and an unfamiliar man standing in the farthest pew, silent, unmoving, as if made of wax. No one had seen him enter. No one had heard his footsteps, but suddenly, there he was, coat too heavy for the season, shoes muddy, eyes blank. He waited until the verger stepped outside. Then he stepped forward. His movements were too smooth, as if he was floating. He walked right up to Father Brown, leaned in close, and whispered something. Only 5 words. No one else heard. But the moment they were spoken, the man turned and disappeared. Not walked away, not exited. He was simply gone, as if he had never been there. Father Brown stood frozen, his face ashen. For the first time in years, his hands trembled. The broom fell from his grip. He looked toward the empty pews, then to the door, then down at the floor where the man had stood. There was nothing. No footprint, no dropped item, no indentation in the dust. Only a smell, faint, metallic, like rain on iron. When the verger returned, he found Father Brown still standing there, pale and distant. "What did he say to you, Father?" the verger asked. Father Brown didn't answer. He couldn't, because those 5 words had paralyzed something deep inside him, something that had remained untouched even through war, loss, and years of dark confessions. He didn't sleep that night, and when he returned to the chapel the next morning, the first pew had been scorched, burnt in the shape of a man's silhouette. The wood charred, but nothing else in the church was damaged. Not a single candle disturbed, not a single hymn book touched, but the burn was real, and it was fresh. The bishop was called. He ordered an investigation. The pew was removed, but when they tried to sand the charred wood, they found something beneath the surface, engraved, deep, old, a name, one no one recognized except Father Brown. Because it was the name the man had whispered, and it was the name from a case that had haunted Father Brown's younger years. A case he had never solved, a murder that should never have happened. 30 years earlier, a boy named Samuel Clare had been found dead behind the rectory wall. No wounds, no trauma, but his hands had been placed neatly over his heart, and a string of rosary beads had been pushed deep into his throat. No one had been charged, no motive ever uncovered, and the case had been buried, literally and bureaucratically, until now, because the name on the pew was Samuel Clare, and the whisper had been, "He's not in his grave." Father Brown visited the cemetery that evening. Samuel's stone was there, old, cracked. But when he tried to open the crypt records, he found something disturbing. There was no burial log, no coffin order, no autopsy, just a name and a single note, written in faded ink, by request of the priest. But Father Brown had never made that request. He had never signed anything, and yet the signature at the bottom matched his, perfectly, even the ink blot on the B, as if someone had forged it not just with skill, but with intimate knowledge. The next night, the dreams began. Father Brown saw the chapel filled with people in old clothing, dead eyes, staring forward, mouths open, all whispering the same 5 words. He couldn't hear them in the dream, but he felt them, like heat against his chest. He woke each night gasping, heart pounding, throat dry. And in the morning, his mirror was fogged, always fogged, with 5 finger streaks on the surface. He stopped shaving, stopped looking into mirrors, and when asked if he was ill, he simply smiled and said, "I heard something I wasn't meant to understand." Then came the second disappearance. The verger, gone, vanished from his home, no signs of struggle, only a single candle left burning in the window, melted down to the wick, and beneath it, a note. "He was there when I spoke." No signature, but the handwriting matched the signature on the burial request, matched Father Brown's. Exactly. The bishop demanded answers. Father Brown provided none. Instead, he returned to the chapel alone. He walked to the place where the man had stood and whispered the same 5 words. The walls shuddered, a single window cracked, and the bells, though untouched, rang once, not loudly, but as if in response. Then something fell from the rafters, a feather, black, slick with something thick and red. But no birds lived in the church, and the rafters were sealed. The next morning, Father Brown dug. He returned to Samuel Clare's grave and exhumed it himself. What he found made him drop to his knees. The coffin was filled with earth. Only earth. No body, no bones, no rosary, just a tiny mirror, perfectly clean, reflecting only blackness. When he brought it back to the rectory, he locked it away. But each morning, it had moved. Each day, it tilted slightly more, always toward the chapel, until the morning it shattered, with no sound, no pressure, just shattered. And when he opened the box, a photograph lay beneath the glass, of the man, the whisperer, standing beside a boy, Samuel Clare, smiling. In the background, the chapel. But there was one problem. The photo was dated 2 weeks after Samuel's death, and the boy's eyes were wrong, too dark, too large, too still. Father Brown burned the photo, but the image never left him. It stayed behind his eyes, etched like ash. When asked days later if he remembered what the man whispered, Father Brown nodded and finally spoke, but not his voice, not his tone, something deeper, something that made the room go cold. He said, "He's walking again, through the walls, through the air, through us." And then he fainted. When he woke, he didn't remember saying anything, didn't remember speaking at all. But everyone who heard him did. They remember. And they say it wasn't his voice. They say it sounded like wind through bones, like laughter underwater, like something remembering how to speak again. And now, every week, at dusk, the chapel door creaks open by itself. No wind, no footsteps, just air, and sometimes a figure, blurry, at the edge of vision, watching, waiting. And if you stand in the first pew, if you lean forward, some say you'll hear the whisper too, but they all say the same thing afterward. He spoke, then he was gone. Chapter 8. The Letter That Burned Everything. The house didn't catch fire until the letter was opened, and by the time they found the ashes, no one could prove it had ever been written at all. It was supposed to be a quiet evening at the Edgecombe estate, a grey manor with ivy-choked walls and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. Lady Miriam Edgecombe, reclusive and ailing, had summoned Father Brown for a final confession. Her voice had grown weak in recent weeks, and the villagers whispered she was holding something terrible in, though no one knew what. When Father Brown arrived, the butler led him up the staircase with a grim look, pausing only to whisper that something had changed in the house the night before. A door had slammed shut on its own, and the library smelled like smoke, though no logs had burned. Lady Miriam, propped up in her high-backed chair, had a letter in her lap. She didn't hand it to him. She simply said, "I need you to read this, but not here, not now, not until after I've gone." Father Brown hesitated. He didn't like games, especially not ones played with fire. He took the letter, tucked it into his coat, and asked her the usual questions. She refused to answer. Instead, she said one thing. He said he would come back for it, and if he did, the whole thing would burn. And then she died. No final prayer, no last breath of peace, just silence. Father Brown rode home in the rain, letter still in his pocket, untouched. He felt it growing warmer with every step toward the rectory, though he told himself it was nothing. The envelope was plain, old parchment sealed with wax, no insignia, no writing. He placed it on his desk and tried to sleep, but the scratching began at midnight. Not on the door, not on the windows, from inside the desk drawer. He opened it. The letter was gone, but in its place was a photograph, sepia, curled with age, showing Lady Miriam as a young woman, standing beside a man in priest's robes. Not Father Brown, and not any priest he recognized, but his face had been scratched out, violently, as if by fingernails. The next morning, the fire brigade arrived at the Edgecombe estate. The house had burned down, every floor, every room, but the library, the very room where Lady Miriam had sat, was untouched, and on the table, unharmed by smoke or flame, was the letter, unopened, sealed with the same wax. When Father Brown arrived, he asked no questions. He picked up the envelope, and this time the seal was broken. But there was nothing inside, only black dust. The inspector called it arson. But the photos taken that morning all failed to develop. They came back blank, except for one, a single Polaroid, showing the moment the fire began. Lady Miriam's portrait on the wall, smiling, though she had never smiled in her life. And in the mirror behind her, the same faceless priest. No one could identify him, but when Father Brown returned to his study, he found his Bible open to a verse he hadn't read in years. "The fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is." He knew then the letter wasn't meant for him. It was bait, and someone, or something, had wanted it to be opened. He traced the origin of the wax seal. It had been used once before, in 1904, on a letter sent to the Archbishop of Ely. That letter had also been destroyed in a fire, and the man who delivered it, unknown, described only as tall, pale, and wearing robes no diocese recognized. A wandering priest, the kind that didn't exist until they did. Father Brown searched church archives, found a notation in the margins of an old registry. A priest named Alaric de Lorche, excommunicated in 1877 for attempting to rewrite judgment in ink. His letters had been seized. Each one had burned the hands of those who touched them. And his final one, his last letter, was rumored to have been buried with him. But the grave was empty, only a burned patch of earth, and a single black feather, the same kind that had appeared in Father Brown's desk drawer the day after Lady Miriam died. He now knew what the letter was, a summoning, but not of a person, of a truth, one too dangerous to speak. That night, the village bell tower cracked in two. No wind, no quake, just a single sound, like a scream made of stone. And then every fireplace in the village, every hearth, every stove, ignited at once, flames with no fuel, fire with no smoke, and then it stopped, all at once, leaving no ash, only the faint scent of wax and fear. The postman went missing that week. His satchel was found in the woods, empty, but beneath it was a sheet of parchment, identical to Lady Miriam's letter. On it, in blood, "He will write again." Father Brown boarded up his study, sealed his drawers, burned his robes, and for the first time in his life, he considered leaving the cloth. But then he received a package, wrapped in brown paper, no address. Inside was a second letter, same seal, same wax, same heat pulsing from its folds. He didn't open it. He buried it, deep, behind the chapel. No ceremony, no prayer. And every day since, he walks to the grave and checks the soil. Because some mornings, it's warm. And once, only once, it's smoked. When asked what was in the first letter, he only says, "Some truths write themselves. And once they do, they don't stop until everything else is ash." Then he turns away and locks the drawer again. Chapter 9. What he whispered before dying. The man's final whisper was so horrifying that Father Brown didn't write it down. He burned the page before he even finished hearing it. They found Leonard Trask lying face down on the stone steps of St. Michael's bell tower, blood pooling beneath him, but no wound on his body. His mouth was open, lips cracked, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something that didn't belong to this world. The wind had been still that night, and no one had rung the bell for hours. Yet it was tolling slowly when they found him, once every 30 seconds, though no one had pulled the rope. And when Father Brown knelt beside the dying man, Leonard gripped his cassock with shaking fingers and whispered 6 words, words that made Father Brown recoil. Then stand up in stunned silence. When the villagers asked what he had heard, Father Brown didn't answer. He simply took out his notebook, began to write, and then stopped. His hand trembled. Then he tore out the page, held it over a candle, and watched it burn to black curls of ash. The village had always known Leonard Trask as a harmless drunk, a man more familiar with pub stools than pews, always muttering stories about what he saw when he was young. Most had dismissed him, but lately he had become quiet, nervous, always glancing at shadows, clutching at his coat, like he was hiding something inside it, something that might scream if let loose. No one had taken much notice, until he died, until the whisper. Father Brown knew immediately that something was wrong with the body. There were no bruises, no cuts, no signs of trauma, just a strange mark near his throat, faint, like a smudge of ash in the shape of an eye. And around his neck, tucked beneath his collar, was a rosary, twisted into a knot so tight that one of the beads had cracked. But Leonard hadn't been to Mass in years, And the rosary didn't belong to him. It belonged to a boy named Eli Hargrove, dead for over 20 years. A suicide. Or so they said. Eli had been a choir boy at St. Michael's. Bright, quiet. One night he climbed the same bell tower and threw himself off. No note, no reason. But afterward, strange things began to happen. The tower bell rang on its own. Father Mullins, the priest at the time, left town without explanation. And a few weeks later, Leonard Trask vanished for nearly 3 months, only to return gaunt, pale, and unable to explain where he had been. Now Leonard was dead, and whispering the name of a boy long buried. Father Brown asked for the church records from the year Eli died. They were missing. The entire ledger had been removed from the archive shelf. In its place was a burned envelope. No stamp, just a single word on the front. Remember. Inside was a photo. Eli Hargrove at his first communion. His smile wide, forced, his hands folded. But behind him, blurry and distorted, was someone watching. Not a priest, not a parent. The figure stood in the shadows between pews, tall, angular, with fingers too long, and a face so faint it barely existed. The ink in that part of the photo seemed to have melted. Father Brown felt something cold pass through his chest. He took the photo to Leonard's cottage, hoping to find some journal, some note. But the cottage was worse than he imagined. The windows were all boarded up from the inside. Every mirror had been covered with torn hymn pages, and the fireplace was filled with charred scraps of paper. Mostly pages from prayer books, but among them was a torn letter. One fragment remained. It read, "He never fell. He was taken." Father Brown dropped to one knee, heart pounding. He reached for his notebook again and tried to draw what he'd seen in the photo. But every time he sketched the outline, his hand slipped, or the pencil snapped, or his vision blurred, as if something in his mind refused to hold the image, something too dark to be remembered fully. He went to the bell tower, climbed the steps alone, and at the top, etched into the underside of the bell, were dozens of small carvings, names, all of them boys. Some he recognized, some he didn't, but one name had been carved deeper than the rest, Leonard Trask, and next to it, 3 symbols, an eye, a flame, and a cross turned upside down. Father Brown touched the markings, and the bell rang, without movement, without wind, a single, low, groaning sound that made his teeth ache. He staggered back. That night, he dreamed of the bell tower, empty, except for a boy, Eli, standing beside the bell, smiling, but his mouth didn't move. And yet in the dream, Father Brown heard it again. The same 6 words Leonard had whispered before dying. This time, he understood them, and he woke screaming. He couldn't speak for 2 hours after. And when he did, he refused to repeat the words to anyone. But he began writing, pages and pages, then burning them all. Until one morning, there was a knock at the rectory door. A woman, middle-aged, trembling. She introduced herself as Eli's sister, said she'd moved away after the death, but something had brought her back. She'd had a dream, she said. Same as Father Brown's, same smile, same tower. And when she described what the boy said to her, those same 6 words, Father Brown turned pale and asked her to leave. Some truths, he told her, only live when you speak them. Don't speak them. The next day, she was gone, her suitcase still in the inn, the key left in the lock, but she was nowhere to be found. The innkeeper said she went for a walk near the church and never came back. Father Brown climbed the tower one last time. At the top, beside the bell, he found her scarf, wrapped around the cracked bead of the same rosary Leonard had worn, and a new name carved beside the others. Her name, fresh, still bleeding. He knew then what was happening. The whisper wasn't a message. It was an invitation, a doorway, one that opened only when someone listened, truly listened. The whisper was a seed, and once you carried it, you became part of the tower. Another name on the bell, another memory buried in fire. And so Father Brown began to forget. Pieces of time disappeared from his mind, moments stolen, weeks blurred. He would wake to find his Bible rearranged, pages torn, sermons erased. Until one morning, his notebook was blank, every page, except the last. It held 6 words, in Leonard's handwriting. Don't whisper what you remember. But it was too late. He remembered everything, and he whispered, to himself, and to something that had no name. And now, on windy nights, the bell tower creaks and sometimes rings. But no one goes to check, because they say the bell no longer rings to warn. It rings to welcome. And when asked about Leonard Trask, Father Brown simply says, he died whispering the door open, and I may be next. Chapter 10. The Witness Who Vanished Overnight. She was the only person who saw the murder happen, and 12 hours after giving her statement, every record of her existence was gone. Her name was Catherine Merrin, a mild, polite schoolteacher from the outskirts of Kemble Cross. She wasn't the sort of woman who caused trouble. She didn't gossip. She didn't stay out late. She never left her curtains open. That night, she had been walking home from choir practice, a route she'd taken for nearly 20 years, when she saw it. A man in a dark coat, standing over the body of Mayor Linton in the rain-slick alley behind the post office. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She watched, memorized everything, then calmly walked to the station and reported it. Her description was precise, unnervingly so. She remembered the murderer's boots, his gloved hand, the blood dripping onto a crumpled paper in the man's fist. She even described a low whistle he was humming as he walked away. The constables believed her immediately. Her statement matched the scene exactly, even details that hadn't been released. She was placed under protective observation, her testimony recorded in full. She was escorted back to her cottage, tucked safely in for the night, with 2 officers stationed outside. The case, finally, was beginning to break open. But by morning, Catherine was gone, her bed unslept in, her door still locked from the inside, her coat still hanging by the fire. But Catherine Merrin was no longer in the house. And not just in the house, anywhere. No signs of struggle, no prints, no broken windows. She had simply ceased to exist. The 2 constables stationed outside swore no one had come or gone. They hadn't closed their eyes once. But when asked to describe Catherine's face, they hesitated. One said brown hair, the other said black. One recalled blue eyes, the other insisted green. Their confusion deepened when they were shown her photograph, and both claimed they had never seen her before. Then things turned stranger. Her school records vanished from the county office. Her bank account froze and displayed 0 activity, going back 10 years. Her neighbors claimed they'd never met a Catherine Merrin, though her cottage had been occupied for decades. Father Brown was called in, not to investigate, but to console. He had known Catherine, had taken her confession once, years ago. She was real. He remembered her kindness, her precision, the way she always brought him hand-sewn bookmarks during Lent. But now, her home was empty, her name gone from the parish rolls, her grave plot reserved but unmarked. He returned to the station to request the written statement she gave. The drawer was empty. The entire report had vanished, not misfiled, burned, as if it had never existed. And yet the tape remained. One audio reel, unlabeled. When Father Brown played it, the static cleared, and there it was. Her voice, calm, clear, precise. I saw him. I saw what he did. I saw who he really is. But when the constable paused the tape and asked, "Who did you see, Miss Merrin?" there was silence. And then Catherine's voice returned, but this time different. Lower, slower, almost mechanical. She said, "You already know his name." And then a click, as if something ended the recording from the inside. Father Brown felt a chill rise from the base of his spine, because the voice that ended the recording wasn't Catherine's, and it wasn't the constable's. It was something else, something watching. The reel was taken to forensics, but the reel was blank. No signal, no audio, as if the recording had deleted itself after being played once. Father Brown took the last step he could. He visited Catherine's cottage. He prayed. He waited. And in the fireplace, behind the grate, he found something no one else had noticed. A page, burnt at the edges, written in her handwriting. It read, "He knew I remembered him, but he doesn't exist unless we say he does." Father Brown closed the page gently and whispered her name aloud. Catherine Merrin. And in that moment, the wind stopped, the birds silenced, and every candle in the chapel blew out. He tried to say it again, but no sound came. That night he dreamed of Catherine, standing at the edge of the woods, not afraid, but flickering, like a candle in water. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, only the shape of 6 words. And in the morning, Father Brown wrote them down, then burned the page, because he remembered what happened to the last one who tried to remember her out loud. And when asked by the constable what he believed happened to Catherine Merrin, he only said, "She witnessed something the world cannot remember, and now it has forgotten her in return." But the real question remains, if Catherine Merrin never existed, who gave the statement? And who exactly are we trying to forget? Chapter 11. Father Brown suspects the priest. The moment Father Brown shook the visiting priest's hand, he knew he wasn't meeting a man of God. He was meeting a man who had already buried his soul. It began with a knock at the rectory door just after Vespers. Rain trailed in through the open frame as Father Brown looked up to find a tall, thin figure dressed in a black cassock. The man introduced himself as Father Alden Ray, sent from the diocese on temporary reassignment while renovations were underway at St. Jude's Abbey. His smile was serene, his voice polished, his paperwork impeccable. No one questioned it. Not the bishop, not the townspeople, and certainly not the congregation, who were instantly taken with his charm, his sermons, and his ability to remember every name after hearing it once. But Father Brown felt something shift. It wasn't jealousy or suspicion. It was instinct, and it began with the handshake. The man's hand was cold, not chilled, but lifeless, too smooth, too light, like it had never truly held anything human. When asked about his parish, Father Ray offered vague replies. When invited to dine, he claimed to fast every evening. When pressed on liturgical opinions, he gave no answers, only questions, questions that dug deeper than doctrine ever should. "What do you think God remembers when we lie in confession?" he once asked, his eyes never blinking. The room had gone silent, and Father Brown had forced a smile. Within days of Father Ray's arrival, strange things began to happen. The candles in the nave burned lower than usual, their flames bent unnaturally even without wind. The statue of St. Michael was found turned to face the wall one morning, though no one had touched it. A child in the front pew fainted during Mass, and when she awoke she asked, "Where did the other priest go? The one with no face?" Father Brown dismissed nothing. He visited the diocesan records. No Father Alden Ray was ever assigned to St. Jude's. No renovation had been approved. The man's identification was a perfect forgery. But worse, it was dated 5 years prior and sealed with the signature of a bishop who had died 4 years ago. He returned to the rectory in silence, heart pounding. He didn't confront Father Ray, not yet. Instead, he watched, listened, waited. That night, Father Brown heard chanting from the chapel, not Latin, not English, something older, rough. He approached the doors quietly and peeked through the stained glass. What he saw couldn't be real. Father Ray stood alone at the altar, arms outstretched, head tilted back, but his shadow did not match him. It danced differently, it moved faster, and behind him, faintly glowing, was a second silhouette, flickering, tall, impossible. Father Brown stepped back, nearly falling. By the time he opened the doors, the chapel was empty. No sign of anyone. The altar cloth untouched, the candles unlit, and yet the stone beneath the pulpit was hot, like something had just stepped through. The next day, Father Ray gave a sermon. It was unlike anything Father Brown had heard. Every sentence seemed designed to disorient. He spoke of forgiveness as a weight, not a gift. He spoke of sin as memory, not action. And when he reached the line, "God forgets the righteous first," a woman in the fifth pew wept uncontrollably. She wouldn't stop. She didn't even know why. That night, she vanished, gone from her home, her bed untouched. Only one thing remained on her pillow, a note in her handwriting that read, "He said, my sins remembered me." But she hadn't written it, because she had no memory of sin, no memory of anything after that Mass. Father Brown visited her home, found her Bible, and inside was a torn page, not from the scriptures, from a letter addressed to Father Ray. It read, "I buried them where you told me, but they still knock." Father Brown held the paper in shaking hands. He knew now this was no man of the church. This was someone who had slipped through the cracks of identity, of ritual, of memory itself. He searched the rectory where Father Ray stayed, found nothing personal, no clothing, no toiletries, no suitcase, just a single journal on the nightstand, blank, except the last page, written in a hand eerily close to Father Brown's own. It said, "You're not supposed to know." He returned to the chapel. Father Ray stood at the altar again, this time waiting. "I know what you suspect," he said calmly. "Do you?" Father Brown replied. Father Ray smiled, and his eyes flickered, not blinked, but flickered, as if something inside was correcting itself. "I came to remind this place," he said, "of what it forgot." "And what is that?" "That the cloth does not belong to God. It belongs to whoever wears it longest." Father Brown gripped the rosary beneath his robes. He felt the beads burn his skin. He didn't speak again. He simply turned and walked. He sent a letter to the bishop that night, but the letter returned, unopened, stamped, "No such diocese." The next morning, Father Ray was gone. No trace, no footprints, no records. Even the parishioners began to forget him. When asked who gave the sermon that week, they couldn't remember. Some said Father Brown, others said there had been no Mass. But in the chapel, beneath the pulpit, someone found a scrap of cloth, black, burnt at the edges, and on it, stitched in red thread, "You were right to suspect." When asked if he knew where the false priest had gone, Father Brown only said, "Some priests hear confessions, others collect them." And then he sealed the chapel doors and never let anyone preach from the altar again. Chapter 12. A lie buried beneath confession. The man confessed to a murder that never happened until they dug up the church floor and found the body he described in perfect detail. It began with a whisper behind the lattice. Father Brown had heard thousands of confessions, some mundane, some shattering, but this one was different. The voice on the other side wasn't frantic or weeping. It was calm, chillingly calm. The man said his name was Patrick Rowe and that he had killed someone 30 years ago. I buried him, he said, under the chapel floor, right beneath the 6th pew from the left. You walk over him every day. Father Brown's blood ran cold, not because of the words, but because he instantly recognized the voice. Patrick Rowe had died 10 years ago, in prison, for a different crime. But the voice was his, exactly as Father Brown remembered. He said nothing aloud, just listened. You won't believe me, the voice continued. They never do. But when they dig, they'll find what I left. And what he said before I silenced him, it's still there, in the mouth. The jaw is locked, but if you force it open, you'll hear it too. Then silence. Father Brown stepped out of the confessional. No one was there. No footsteps, no door creak, only stillness. The verger swore no one had entered the church, and the floor beneath the 6th pew, solid, undisturbed. But Father Brown couldn't let it go. He pulled the old blueprints of the chapel from the archives, and something caught his eye. A renovation had been done in 1993, funded quietly without diocesan approval. New flooring laid. But the logs showed no reason for the work. No rot, no damage, just an anonymous request. When he questioned the builder, now retired, the man said, I was told to cover a hole. Just a patch job. Didn't ask questions. Paid in cash. We were told it was an old wine storage. But there was no wine cellar beneath the chapel. There never had been. Father Brown had the floorboards removed. Carefully, piece by piece. And there beneath the concrete was soil. Packed, unsettled, different from the rest. He dug with his own hands, and 3 feet down, he found it. A skeleton, arms crossed, face twisted, mouth slightly open, as if still trying to speak. The forensics team arrived. The bones were dated to approximately 30 years ago. The man had died from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, and lodged between his teeth a strip of cloth, monk's cloth, from the old robes worn by the choir masters in the 1980s and stitched in the seam, almost invisible, property of P. Rowe. Father Brown's knees gave out when he saw it, because Patrick Rowe had never been a choir master. He had been a groundskeeper, dismissed quietly after allegations surfaced of theft and misconduct, but no one had ever mentioned a disappearance. No missing person, no open case, because the dead man had never been reported missing, which meant either no one noticed or someone made sure no one could. The body was identified as Thomas Merrow, an archivist, quiet, gentle, devoted. He had been cataloguing the diocesan records when he vanished. The diocese had claimed he transferred to another post, but no transfer record existed, no forwarding address, only silence. And now, bones, a dead man whispering from beyond. The whispers grew stranger. In the days after the discovery, the confessional felt different. The lattice grew cold, the air staler. Then came the notes, slipped beneath Father Brown's door, each written in perfect block print, each unsigned. The first said, he wasn't supposed to confess. The second, that wasn't Patrick. And the third, you heard the voice, so did I. The verger, too, had begun hearing things, soft scraping in the chapel at night, a voice humming the Kyrie from the old funeral masses. But no one else was there. The bishop urged Father Brown to stop digging. He refused. Instead, he returned to the prison where Patrick Rowe had died, spoke to the chaplain. And the chaplain, pale and hesitant, admitted something shocking. Patrick changed the night before he died, he said. He kept repeating a name, said he'd buried something more important than a body, said he had buried a lie. Father Brown asked for Patrick's last words. The chaplain handed him a torn page from a Bible and scrawled across it, "What I confessed was not my sin. It was someone else's memory." Then Father Brown realized what the voice in the confessional had meant. It wasn't a confession, it was a return. The floor of the chapel wasn't just a grave, it was a seal, and breaking it had brought back more than just bones. The cloth in the mouth hadn't decayed, the voice had not faded. And one night, Father Brown woke to find a letter on his pillow. No name, no handwriting, just 4 words. Come back to confess. He didn't sleep again. And when he next entered the confessional, the seat across from him was already warm, occupied, though the door had never opened. A voice whispered from the other side, "I never died. You buried the lie." And then silence. But from that silence, something else grew. A memory, not his, but inside him, of the blow that killed Thomas, of the moment the robe was torn, of the decision to cover the body. But he had never done it. He had never been there. Except now, he remembered. Because the lie that was buried beneath confession was never about who killed Thomas Merrow. It was about who let it happen, and who listened, and did nothing. And the voice that returned was not Patrick Rowe's voice. It was Thomas's. It had learned to speak again, through the shape of a lie. And when the bishop asked what truly happened, Father Brown only said, "Confession is meant to absolve, but some sins are not forgiven. They are remembered." And he burned his notebook and sealed the confessional and never opened it again, because if he did, he knew the voice would finish the sentence.